All right, if you're just joining us, we're following breaking news. A major prisoner swap is underway between the U.S. and Russia. Americans Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan are among the list of prisoners to be freed. Also among them, American-Russian journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, also believed to be headed home. We have CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis with us. We also have the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, on the phone. We're going to get to Mr. Sullivan in a bit, but Olivia, I want to start with you. If you can talk about who else is included in this swap.
Sure. I think we're still learning those details as they're being released. We do know that it is a constellation of prisoners that the Russians have held and that the U.S. has held. The three Americans who are coming home are being given to the Russians at a cost, right? We do know that the Russians were keenly interested in a convicted murderer held in a German prison known as Vadim Krasikov. He assassinated a Chechen, Georgian who fought against Russian troops in Chechnya and had been serving a life sentence in Germany. We understood the Russians to be keenly interested in him, but of course he wasn't in the U.S.'s custody. So we have to see whether that he was part of the final deal that finally got this over the finish line. We understand that it is one of the most complex deals, as officials who were involved in it described it to me, in U.S., Russian, and even U.S. Soviet history, when, again, spy swaps were the norm. In 2014, there was a massive spy swap between the U.S. and Russia in which 10 Russians went back, and officials said this was even more complex than that one.
Olivia, these three Americans coming home certainly cause to celebrate, but there are other Americans still being held in Russia. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. It is important to note that this is a huge success. These three Americans had a lot of attention paid to their cases. In the cases of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, they were deemed wrongfully detained by the U.S. government. Alsu's case got personal attention from President Biden and was going through the State Department's deliberative process in terms of determining whether she was officially wrongfully detained. But there are still a number of Americans who are held in Russian prisoners, among them a teacher, Mark Fogel, whose family has also been very vocal in trying to get him released. There's a musician recently taken named Michael Travis Leak, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Gordon Black, recently imprisoned, and a Russian-American ballerina, Ksenia Karelina, who remains imprisoned. Their cases probably not as clear-cut. Again, the U.S. has a very specific deliberative process through which it determines whether these are actually political prisoners or whether, as Ambassador Sullivan was describing, they committed some minor infraction or even broke a Russian law and therefore received outsized punishments by the Russian government.
Olivia, what type of conversations had to have been taking place to involve so many agencies and so many countries?
Sure. Well, we know from past cases that the Russians don't like to deal with diplomats as much as they like to deal with intelligence officers. Very often, these cases are handled by the CIA, which has run point in the past for very sensitive negotiations, including Brittany Griner. And that's more the Russians' preference than the U.S. preference. I think the U.S. would have preferred to engage diplomatically in all of these cases so as not to lend credence to the idea that either Paul Whelan or Evan Gershkovich had in any way connections to the agency or to espionage or to any sort of activity of that kind. And that's why they would have preferred diplomatic channels. But the Russians often insist on keeping things quiet, on wheeling dealing, and on dealing with the CIA via their intelligence services in these kinds of discussions.
What can you tell us about the process where the U.S. government tries to determine when Russia accuses an American? How does the U.S. government respond to that and determine that somebody is actually a political prisoner?
Sure. It can be a lengthy process, and there are strict guidelines by which it is done. When an American is detained anywhere overseas, U.S. officials immediately request consular access to that person. They try to get a lawyer in the room. They try to get U.S. diplomats in the room to understand what exactly has come to pass, what the person may be charged with, or what the allegations are. From there, it's not a public process, but it is a deliberative process within the SPIHA, which is the Special Presidential Envoy's office, who will determine whether their cases actually violated a local law, or whether this is, again, somebody taken capriciously by a foreign government and is being held as a political prisoner. There's no visibility into that process, but it has guidelines established by Congress that the U.S. uses in order to officially declare somebody wrongfully detained or not.
Well, Olivia, as we're having this conversation, we have live pictures of the plane landing in Turkey now, carrying these Americans home. What were Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, Alsu Kurmasheva, what were they facing if this deal didn't happen as far as a life in a prison in Russia?
What a moment. Let's just pause. I mean, the fact that we're getting pictures of an exchange in Turkey is absolutely historic. Obviously, a third country that everybody needed to agree on for this swap to take place. I got chills when you told me that it was actually happening. An incredible moment in which a very hard-fought negotiation appears to have succeeded. In all of these cases, Paul Whelan, again, was the longest-held American detainee in Russia, was in a penal colony, was beaten, had his things taken away, was abused, told these stories when he managed to get them out of the Russian penal colony where he was being held. He was sentenced to 16 years in that kind of a Russian prison for charges that, again, the U.S. has insisted were trumped up. His family has said are absolutely false, and he, of course, has maintained his innocence throughout. Evan Gershkovich, arrested during a reporting trip to Yekaterinburg in 2023, guilty of nothing more, as we have heard the slogans, than committing the act of journalism, which, of course, is not a crime. But he was sentenced in a very hasty trial in early July to also 16 years in a Russian penal colony. We saw the pictures of him in the Russian cell. We could not hear him, but we saw him at some points try to express optimism, holding up a heart symbol, smiling for the press. And we have routinely heard U.S. government officials who have met with them, diplomats on the ground in Russia, describe them as resilient, as strong, as really keeping up their spirits in the face of incredible adversity for years, and in Whelan's case, years and years.
And as we watch these pictures, the live picture of the plane bringing these Americans home, you have to think about the families who have been afraid that they may never see their loved ones again. I want to bring in White House correspondent for the Associated Press, Zeke Miller. Zeke, can you tell us, have we heard anything from the White House?
We have not heard anything from the White House, and I would not expect to hear anything from them until these Americans are wheels up back to the United States. That's something that we've seen in other reported prisoner swaps that have taken place under multiple administrations. They are very tight-lipped until the moment where they are in U.S. custody and out of Russian custody and on their way safely back to their families.
Now, this is all happening at such a critical time in American politics. We're less than 100 days away from an election. President Biden just a short time ago made the decision to not run for re-election. How big a deal is this for the Biden administration?
I mean, this has been one of the major foreign policy priorities of the president. In the case of Paul Whelan, for pretty much his entire administration, and Evan Gershkovich the last year and change since his detention. So this has certainly been very high on the list for President Biden and his administration. And it was one of the things that he mentioned as something that he wanted to get done in his final 6 months in office, in that Oval Office address just a little over a week ago. So being able to potentially bring it, show a deliverable on one of his top priorities for the end of his time of his one and only term in office is certainly a feather in the cap for the president's foreign policy legacy that he's trying to show the American people in his closing days, with less than 6 months left before he leaves the White House.
Zeke, I know the families of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich have been trying desperately to keep their loved ones in the national spotlight and put pressure on the White House. Have you heard, has the White House been having conversations with the Whelan family, the Gershkovich family? Has there been a lot of pressure to make this happen?
There's certainly been ongoing conversations between the White House, the State Department, other U.S. government officials, and the Whelan Gershkovich families, the families of all detained Americans, not just in Russia, but in other countries as well. That's been a priority of the Biden administration. It was also a priority of the Trump administration. to sort of keep an open line of communication with the families, making them feel seen, making them feel heard. In different contexts, we've seen that from the White House, the Biden administration, with in the case of American citizens who were detained in Hamas captivity in the October 7th attack in Israel. So that has been sort of a hallmark of how the U.S. government, over the last decade, has approached the issue of wrongfully detained or American hostages held anywhere as a transparent, ongoing conversations with the families. And certainly, if this deal is concluded, we'll certainly hear a lot more about the depth and duration and the cadence of those conversations.
Again, all of this is happening in the midst of our presidential race. Donald Trump has said that if he won the White House again, he would get Evan Gershkovich released on day one. He has been saying that. He has been promising that. The fact that this happened today under the Biden administration, how significant is that?
It certainly does neuter a political message that former President Trump was going to use on the campaign trail. But this is one of those moments that really does transcend politics. This is, the return of Americans held overseas, is sort of foundational to the role of a president of any party. And so you would sort of like to see some sort of bipartisan consensus around doing this. At the same time, it's hard to turn the blinders on in the political year. Certainly, there'll be some sort of politically tinged reaction, particularly as we learn about the other side of that agreement, who had to be traded in order to secure the release of these men. And those are very tough policy calls. And certainly there may be some things there that some people may criticize. So it'll be very interesting to see how, on one hand, you're talking about the very positive release of potential release of Americans held wrongfully overseas, but also at what cost, and how that will play out in the public space and the political space is something we'll have to follow in the days and weeks ahead.
And we want to mention that we've learned that the families of the released Americans have been invited to the White House. Again, we are seeing live pictures of a plane in Turkey carrying these 3 Americans back home. We're still awaiting details as to the specifics of this deal, but I want to ask Zeke, is there also the concern about backlash? There will certainly be some who criticize the administration for giving Vladimir Putin what he wants. Though 3 Americans are coming home safe, there are some who argue that this gives an incentive for Putin to continue to do this kind of thing.
Now, that really is a question that is asked every time one of these deals are struck. And it's a valid question because there are no clear-cut answers here. Because on one hand, you do incentivize this sort of behavior on the part of Russia, on the part of other American adversaries to take essentially hostages in order to secure the release of their own priorities or their own international agendas. And that's a policy problem. At the same time, there's we've heard this over multiple administrations, what they view as a moral obligation to try to secure the release of Americans. And I think what we'll probably hear, assuming this deal does go all the way through today, which very hopefully it does, we'll hear more about that soon. Essentially how this administration has had to weigh those complicated concerns. Nobody's, these are moments where, there's joy that you get these Americans back, but nobody's very happy about having to do this sort of arrangement. It is a very tough policy trade-off.
Well, Zeke Miller, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, thanks so much for joining us. I want to turn now to William Pomeranz. He's the senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. First off, thanks so much for joining us, William. Give us a quick overview. Where do U.S.-Russia relations stand right now?
Well, they are in a very difficult position, and it's very encouraging that some of these essentially hostages have been released. But I don't see this as a real turn in U.S.-Russian relations.
How is a deal like this able to be negotiated when tensions are so high between these two countries?
Well, I think it is able to be negotiated because everyone gets something in this exchange. So we're still waiting to see all of the Americans and who they are coming home. But I think that Russia, in the sense, wanted to make a deal. This will be a propaganda coup for them because they have gotten some of their prisoners in the West to the Russian Federation. But I don't think this will have a significant impact on U.S.-Russian relations, especially since the war in Ukraine is ongoing.
William, can you give us a sense of how the Russian court system works? Because we have heard from the U.S. government from the beginning that these Americans did nothing wrong, that they were political prisoners. Can you give us a sense, a little information about the Russian court system, how it works?
Well, the court system is very much biased to the Russian state and the prosecutor's office. And essentially, there is no ability to have a defense for these defendants. So it was a foregone conclusion that they would be convicted. The only positive thing about the conviction is that once they were convicted, the Russians would say they had a fair court system and that they basically indicted and convicted all of the people.
Really powerful moments that we're watching live as the plane sits on the tarmac in Turkey carrying these 3 Americans home. William, if this deal didn't happen, what were these Americans facing? What kind of conditions would they be enduring in a Russian prison?
They would be enduring very harsh conditions. In many cases, no access to families or Western media and so forth. They would be isolated, and it was just a traumatic position for all these Americans who, as you said, did nothing wrong, yet found themselves stuck inside the Russian prison penal system.
Now, we know that several Russian prisoners are being released as part of this exchange. Are there concerns about the concessions that the U.S. had to make in these cases?
We'll have to wait and see who is traded in this swap. Obviously, in the previous swap with Brittany Griner, they swapped a major Russian, basically war criminal and gun runner for Brittany Griner. So we'll have to wait and see as to who is exchanged. But I think that in light of the terrible conditions that these Americans were placed under, I think that a deal will be a positive aspect for this event.
Will Russia and Putin view this as a win as well?
I'm sure he will. He always thinks everything is a win for him. And, you know, Russia has a tradition of no prisoners left behind. And so whoever Russia was able to exchange, I believe that there were some people who had been arrested in Slovakia. But I think Putin will herald this as a win and an attempt to say that Russia was able to get its prisoners and that it made no concessions to the West. Indeed, everyone who was exchanged from the American side had already been convicted.
I want to bring in Olivia Gazis. Olivia, I want to talk about, we have been here before. We've been here with Brittany Griner. We've been here with Trevor Reed. And now we're here with Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan and Alsu Kurmasheva. Are we going to be back here again? Is Putin going to continue to do this? And is there any sort of warning that the U.S. government puts out for Americans that this could happen to them if they travel to Russia?
I think, Michael, as you've been discussing, there is clearly a benefit that the Russians can see to opportunistically taking Americans on its soil and accusing them of something, either legitimately or not, in order to leverage their eventual release. We've seen it happen time and again. And that is why when these cases arise, and this is not to blame the people who go there, but the State Department does stress Russia has a travel advisory in place. It is a level 4. That is the highest level advisory against traveling into the country, precisely because of the dangers that Americans could face if they step foot on a very aggressive adversary's soil. So they try to remind Americans you are not welcome there. You are at risk of being arbitrarily detained there. You are at risk of being imprisoned there. Do not travel. That is hard, of course. There is a robust Russian-American community in the United States. There's plenty of reasons to want to travel for Russia, for reporting, for business, for family relations. So not everybody heeds that warning, but it is a fact that the U.S. government stresses it is dangerous to go there. Do not go, and that's why that travel advisory is in existence.
I also want to ask about what's taking place right now. Again, we're still awaiting the details of this deal, but I have to imagine there are many government agencies involved in the transport of these Americans back home.
Absolutely. We do know from previous cases that this ends up being a whole of government undertaking. It's the White House, it's the State Department, it's the CIA. Think about all of the logistics that need to be involved in coordinating families, in determining where is a sort of neutral territory for the swap to take place, coordinating planes to get there, negotiating with prisons, dealing with justice departments. You can see why it is one of the most complex undertakings and politically fraught undertakings that governments can engage in. The pictures, I assume, show that there are multiple planes on the tarmac. We do know this deal is historically complex in how it was constructed, and we do know that it was a months-long endeavor, and in the case of Paul Whelan, a years-long endeavor by the U.S. government to deal with the Russians, to find the key that would unlock a deal in order to secure the release of the Americans who had been deemed wrongfully detained and that the U.S. wanted to have back.
What was the interest for the U.S. in getting these prisoners home safe, and what international concerns arise when Americans are imprisoned abroad?
Well, I mean, the safety of American citizens, you will hear the U.S. government say, is its paramount interest, right? The U.S. is going to protect whoever it is, wherever it is. It's going to endeavor to bring them home to safety and to their families, especially in cases where these people are arbitrarily detained by a hostile foreign government. We know that Russia is not the only one who does this. There are dozens of other Americans being held overseas in places like China, Venezuela, Iran. And in every case, there is an intensive process that the U.S. government undertakes in order to determine whether these individuals can be released. It becomes more fraught when they have dual citizenship. As we've been discussing, some of the prisoners that Russia has taken have dual American and Russian citizenship, in which case the Russians can claim we are treating this person as a Russian and not as an American citizen. China has done so as well when there have been joint Chinese and American citizens detained on Chinese soil. The Chinese will say we are detaining one of our own citizens, and therefore we do not even have to offer consular access to you. And so that is why this process that we've been talking about of designating somebody wrongfully detained is laborious, requires a lot of lawyers and investigation and dealing with a foreign government in order to say there is actually no there there and we need the citizen back.
I want to turn now to AP White House correspondent Zeke Miller. Zeke, I want to talk about the vice president. I imagine that she will also be at the White House when these Americans arrive home. But how significant is this for her campaign? Will this be something that we see her bring up as she runs for the White House?
Yeah, she's currently in Houston this morning to attend a memorial service for Sheila Jackson Lee, but her schedule has her returning to Washington. So presumably she'd want to be involved in whatever sort of welcome there is here back in the United States. She's a member of the Biden administration, and she, she's running on the Biden-Harris administration record, and this is about to be yet another policy success that she would be able to point to. So it would, I think it's certainly safe to say she's going to, to talk about that in the days and weeks ahead. At the same time, this is not one of those issues that is that moves a ton of votes, but it's a sort of thing that can help show competence and the capability to lead the country that she will try to sort of associate herself with as she tries in the next 96 days to make her case to the American people that she should be in the Oval Office.
William Pomeran, senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. We were talking about U.S.-Russia relations, and one thing that strikes me is that Russian politics, the Putin administration has been indelibly tied to American politics over the last few years. And there is a perception that Putin certainly favors former President Trump winning the White House again. Is it surprising at all that Putin was willing to release these Americans under the Biden administration?
Yes, I think that is surprising in a variety of ways. But I think obviously Russia wanted to make this deal as well. I think it helps Putin's position. I think he would have wanted to wait a little while and maybe get some glory to former President Trump. But I think the pressure, essentially, on world opinion to get some of these people released was a drag on Russia. Again, not that they don't have other problems, serious problems as well, but now this one problem is off the table.
What is the role of Turkey as sort of the stopping point for this prisoner swap?
I think Turkey has tried to play an intermediary role throughout this war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. And so Turkey will gain some prestige by being able to pull off this prisoner swap. And I think Erdogan will use this to try to promote Turkey as an intermediary for some sort of peace deal. I don't know if Erdogan really has the respect of the Ukrainians to do that, but I think he will try to use it as making and establishing Turkey as the peacemaker. And there are lots of attempts to have peace negotiations. And I think this will basically help Erdogan and Turkey to play that role.
William Pomerantz, Olivia Gazis, Zeke Miller, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Again, 3 Americans facing the possibility of years in a Russian prison, now headed home. We'll be back shortly with more.